ਵੈਲਕਮ ਟੂ ਸੀਜੇ ਸਿੱਧੂ ਸ਼ੋ। ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਹੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਐਵਰੀ ਥਰਸਡੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਕਿਸੇ ਨਾ ਕਿਸੇ ਪੋਲੀਟੀਕਲ ਲੀਡਰ, ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਲੀਡਰਸ ਔਰ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਐਕਟਿਵਿਸਟ ਨਾਲ ਥੋੜੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਾਈ ਦੀ ਹੈ। ਅੱਜ ਬੜੇ ਖੁਸ਼ੀ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਮੇਰੇ ਨਾਲ ਸ਼ਾਮਲ ਹਨ BC ਗ੍ਰੀਨ ਪਾਰਟੀ ਦੇ ਲੀਡਰ ਸੋਨੀਆ ਫਰਸਨੋ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿ ਕਾਊਚਨ ਵੈਲੀ ਤੋਂ MLA ਹਨ। So, brief introduction of Sonia. She was raised in Edmonton, and she is a child of a German immigrant. And she attended the University of Victoria starting at age of 20, attaining her master's degree in history and Bachelor of Education. And as you know, she was elected to the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia in 2017 provincial election. And as I mentioned, to represent the district of Cowichan Valley. And she was involved actually in politics in a roundabout way in 2014 when she started working with and elected as a director of the electoral area B within the Cowichan Valley Regional District. And this was after association to protest and appeal a British Columbia provincial permit that allowed the siting of landfill on the banks of the community sources of drinking water. So that's how the political career started. So welcome to CJ Sidhu Show, Sonia.
Oh, I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So let's start. It's a pretty somber day in Canada and worldwide. As you remember, on March 11, World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros announced this COVID-19 as a worldwide pandemic. And Prime Minister Justin Trudeau today in the Parliament designated March 11 as a National Day of Observance. It's a pretty sad day in a lot of ways. We lost over 3 million people worldwide, to over 22,000 people in Canada, and close to 14,000 people in British Columbia. So what are your take and thoughts on March 11 as a observation day for all the people's and lives we lost?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a really important day for us to observe and remember and commemorate all the lives that have lost because of COVID-19 in the last year. And as you point out, it is a very large number of people. But I think what we also have to recognize on this day is that for the loved ones that have lost people in their lives, for people who have lost family members and friends over the last year, in so many cases, we haven't been able to have the connection that we would typically with somebody at the end of their lives. A lot of people have died in isolation, apart from their family members. And then there hasn't been the opportunity to gather and celebrate people's lives, to have religious ceremonies. And this is so important for making our way through grief. And I was thinking a lot today about when I lost my father almost 20 years ago, how important it was to be with him in his final days and weeks and months, and also how important it was to be with family together after that loss that we all shared. And this is the other part of COVID-19 is the tragedy of these lives lost is compounded by the cruelty of the isolation that we've all been facing for the last year.
So Sonia ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਪ੍ਰਾਈਮ ਮਿਨਿਸਟਰ ਨੇ ਅੱਜ ਆਬਜ਼ਰਵੇਸ਼ਨ ਡੇ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਡਿਕਲੇਅਰ ਕੀਤਾ ਇਨ ਮੈਮਰੀ ਆਫ ਆਲ ਦਾ ਪੀਪਲ ਹੂ ਲੋਸਟ। ਸੋ ਸੋਨੀਆ ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਕਿ ਬੜਾ ਦੁਖਾਂਤ ਵਾਲਾ ਇਹ ਦਿਨ ਹੈਗਾ। ਸ਼ੀ ਲੋਸਟ ਹਰ ਫਾਦਰ 20 ਸਾਲ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ, ਐਂਡ ਇਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੀ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਕਰੂਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਰਿਐਲਿਟੀ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਦੇਖਣ ਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਦੀ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਉਹਦੀਆਂ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਗੀਆਂ ਗਵਾਈਆਂ, ਤੇ ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਫੈਮਿਲੀ ਮੈਂਬਰਸ ਹੈ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਦਾ ਕਿੰਨਾ ਇੰਪੈਕਟ ਪਿਆ, ਪਲੱਸ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆਪਾਂ ਆਈਸੋਲੇਸ਼ਨ 'ਚ ਰਹਿ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ। ਸੋ ਹੈਵਿੰਗ ਸੈਡ ਦੈਟ, ਸੋਨੀਆ, you think that as a provincial government or or federally, you more provincial leaders. So did you think we missed the mark, or we lacking in a lot of, look at the long-term care homes, how many lives we lost? So there was a lack of leadership, you think?
I think that we could have been more prepared for a pandemic, and we know that, for example, in Canada, that the office for preparing for a pandemic had been defunded and shut down not long before this COVID-19 hit. I think what's so important right now and moving forward is that we learn the lessons of the tragedies of this last year and of how COVID-19 has impacted families. And as you point out, what have we learned about where long-term care homes have not served the well-being and the dignity and the needs of people? And how do we improve that? So I think, you know, from any moment of tragedy and loss like this, the most important thing for governments to do is to say, how do we do better? And let's begin implementing those policies. During the election, we were calling for the end of for-profit care in British Columbia in long-term care homes. We think that, you know, you can look at the data across the country and you can see that in cases where for-profit operators were operating, particularly in Ontario, the conditions and the outcomes were worse. So we have to ask this fundamental question of ourselves in the wake of this tragedy. Do we see people as a commodity for companies to make profits off of, or do we see the importance that every life has the dignity and the care that it deserves, particularly for seniors at the end of their lives?
And Sonia ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਲਾਈਫ ਲੂਜ਼ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੈ, ਸਪੈਸ਼ਲੀ ਮੈਂ ਪੁੱਛਿਆ ਸੀ ਲੌਂਗ ਟਰਮ ਕੇਅਰ ਹੋਮਸ, ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਲਾਸਟ ਆਫ ਪੀਪਲ, ਜ਼ਿੰਦਗੀ ਦਾ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਲਾਈ ਆਪਾਂ ਆਪਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਰਿਸਪੈਕਟ ਹੈਗੀ, ਡਿਗਨਿਟੀ ਹੈ, ਉਹਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਲੋਸਟ ਕੀਤਾ। ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਐਬਸੋਲੂਟ ਟ੍ਰੈਜਡੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਪ੍ਰਾਈਵੇਟ ਫॉर ਪ੍ਰੋਫਿਟ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸੈਂਟਰਸ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਫੋਕਸ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਬਿਜ਼ਨਸ ਤੇ ਹੁੰਦਾ, ਨਾ ਕਿ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦੀ ਕੇਅਰ ਕਰਨਾ। ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਹਾਲਾਂਕਿ ਓਨਟਾਰੀਓ ਦਾ ਵਰਸਟ ਕੇਸ ਸਿਨੈਰੀਓ ਸੀਗਾ, ਪਰ ਆਪਣਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈਗਾ ਆ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਕੋਈ ਬੈਟਰ picture nahi hegi. So having said that, and you mentioned previously that data collection and then relating also cause a lot of mental health issues, Sonia.
Yeah, these are two things that we have been touching on a great deal the first 2 weeks of the legislature being back. So data collection is so important for governments. BC has not done particularly well in terms of data collection, and particularly around race-based data to understand how COVID-19 has impacted different communities differently. And the importance of having that data is that it then informs government decision-making and policy-making. And we know that COVID-19 has shone a very bright light on inequalities that already exist in British Columbia. But unless we look at the data and the evidence, we're not going to be effective at addressing those inequalities. Mental health is the other thing that we are really leaning into. And last summer, we made a proposal to government to cover mental health under the medical services plan so that cost was not a barrier for people seeking mental health care in BC. We are going to continue to advocate for this. I think it's more important than ever. And we know that this, again, COVID has shown us how important it is to take care of our mental health, but also it's created the opportunity for us to talk more openly about mental health being part of our health and well-being, and about how we need those tools and that capacity to have the ability to take care of our mental health. We need that professional help sometimes so that we don't end up in crisis.
So Sonia ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ question ਪੁੱਛਿਆ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ data collection ਹੈਗਾ, so ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਇਹ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਹੈ ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗ ਸਕੇ ਕਿ different communities ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਇਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ affected ਹੋਈਆਂ, ਤੇ ਇਹ ਇਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਕੋਈ inequalities ਤਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ create ਹੋ ਗਈਆਂ, ਤੇ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਹੀ ਨਾਲ mental health ਜਿਹੜਾ issue ਹੈ, that's a huge issue. ਇਸ ਕੱਲੀ ਕਾਸਟ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗੀ, ਪਰ ਇਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਮੈਂਟਲ ਹੈਲਥ ਇਸ਼ੂਜ਼ ਨਾਲ ਲੋਕੀ ਅਫੈਕਟਡ ਹੋਏ ਆ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਕੇਅਰ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ. ਸੋ you're talking about race-based data, Sonia, and if we look our friends in the South, that the percentage of blacks and Hispanics lot higher than a mainstream Caucasians. So if it's not a bad idea, so we know in Canada or in British Columbia how the numbers are panning out.
Yeah, we don't have the same complete understanding of, and one of the really heartbreaking pieces of data that's come out of the United States, where they have been collecting this, is that a black person or a Hispanic person is more likely to die of COVID-19, but they're going to die at a younger age than a white person. So the inequality of this really just keeps compounding. Here in BC, there has been a lot of data collected around impacts of COVID-19 to Indigenous communities, and that has resulted in the government being more proactive about vaccinating Indigenous communities. If we were collecting data across Black communities, communities of color, we might in fact know that it would be more effective to be moving forward with vaccinations on that front too, but we haven't been. And I think that, there is a concern. Well, collecting race-based data might lead to more racism, and we don't want that in any way, shape, or form. But what's important here is that governments need to have that data and that evidence to truly understand how their policies are impacting people and communities differently, so that we can actually move to a more equal and less racist society. That's so essential.
So Sonia ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜਦੋਂ ਰੇਸ ਬੇਸਡ ਡਾਟਾ ਦੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਸੀ, ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਇਹ ਸੋ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਟ ਹੈ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਬਲੈਕਸ ਹੈ, ਦੇ ਆਰ ਡਾਈਂਗ ਪਰਸੈਂਟੇਜ ਵਾਈਜ਼ ਮੋਰ ਐਂਡ ਦੇ ਆਰ ਡਾਈਂਗ ਐਟ ਅ ਯੰਗਰ ਏਜ. ਤੇ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਇੰਡੀਜਨਸ ਪੀਪਲਸ ਦਾ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ ਆਪਣੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਡਾਟਾ ਕਲੈਕਟ ਕੀਤਾ ਤੇ ਉਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਐਕਟੀਵਿਟੀਜ਼ ਦੇ ਹੈਲਪ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਵਧੀ ਹੈ. ਸੋ ਦੂਸਰੀ ਰੇਸਿਸ ਦੇ ਵੀ ਜੇ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗੂਗਾ ਤਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਆਪਾਂ help better kar sakde hai. So just coming to point of racism, so that data, how that can impact the racism negatively, and how we can, make sure that are very sensitive about this issue.
Yeah, so it's a really important question, CJ, because the last thing we would ever want is for any of the government efforts to be contributing to more racism. And we know that there has been an uptick in racism in British Columbia around COVID-19, particularly aimed at Asian people. And this speaks to a more important element that we have to address here, which is education. Anti-racism in our education system. We have to make sure that from the very youngest age right up into post-secondary, that young people and children are being educated about anti-racism and how to be anti-racist. We really do need to embrace that we are a diverse province and country, and that is our strength, and it is what makes us more resilient. It is what makes us a wonderful place to live. But we need to tackle racism head on in our education system and in our society. And I'm heartened to see steps being taken by government on this front. But we have a long ways to go, and we have to really commit to this work together.
ਸੋ ਸੋਨੀਆ ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਕਿ ਰੇਸਿਜ਼ਮ ਦਾ ਮੈਂ ਕੁਐਸਚਨ ਪੁੱਛਿਆ ਸੀ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਜੇ ਡਾਟਾ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆਇਆ ਤਾਂ ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਰੇਸਿਜ਼ਮ ਵੱਧ ਸਕਦਾ, ਪਰ ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਕਿ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਐਜੂਕੇਟ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਬਹੁਤ ਲੋੜ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ. ਸਕੂਲਾਂ 'ਚ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈਗਾ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਪੜ੍ਹਾਉਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਆਪਾਂ ਡਾਈਵਰਸ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਰੇਸਿਜ਼ਮ ਦੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਬਲਮ ਨੂੰ ਆਪਾਂ ਰਗ ਦੇ ਥੱਲੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਵਾੜ ਸਕਦੇ, ਪਰ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਐਡਰੈਸ ਕਰਨਾ ਪੈਣਾ. ਐਂਡ ਯੂ ਆਰ ਵੈਰੀ ਰਾਈਟ ਸੋਨੀਆ, talk about the Asians in early stages of COVID-19, because it started from China and there was a big rate increase in the crimes and racism against the Asian community.
Yeah, and this is tragic. I mean, we cannot allow for that to be a part of the fabric of society in British Columbia. We just absolutely have to say that that cannot be part of who we are. And it's an important thing for leaders to do, but it's also important for all of us to not accept that in any shape or form amongst our family, our friends, our peers, our co-workers. Is just really, this cannot be part of who we are.
So Sonia ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ racism ਦਾ issue ਹੈਗਾ, ਇਹਦੀ ਹਰ ਟੇਬਲ ਤੇ ਹਰ ਜਗ੍ਹਾ ਤੇ ਗੱਲ ਹੋਣੀ ਚਾਹੀਦੀ ਹੈ, ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਲੋਕੀ ਆ, they are aware of the issue, what's going on, ਤੇ ਇਹਨੂੰ ਫੇਰ ਹੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਇਹਨੂੰ address ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ. And let's digress a little bit and talking about racism. You know, recently the royal couple Harry and Meghan, it was another big news worldwide, and the way Meghan, you know, gave her statements and racist overtones about the skin color of their baby Archie, and you know, and it made like a headlines worldwide. What are your take on that?
I think that we are going to look back at this time, 2020, with the murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, the growing awareness of the ways in which inequality and racism is impacting people and communities. And we are going to recognize this. This is my hope, as a real turning point, in that we are starting to come to terms with the fact that colonialism was a very powerful force in creating kind of racist structures in our societies, and we now have systemic racism. I've done a lot of work on the child welfare file, and we to this day have an extraordinary overrepresentation of indigenous children in care in British Columbia, and that is an extension of the residential school era, of the 60s scoop, and both of those are an extension of a colonialist viewpoint and policy that believed that indigenous people and communities couldn't be trusted to raise their own children. And this is a horrifying part of Canadian history, but the worst part is it's a horrifying part of the Canadian present. This carries on to this day. And so the story of Meghan and Harry and baby Archie and these questions, it shines a light on how much work we still have to do to move beyond systemic racism. The work on the Police Act that my wonderful colleague Adam Olson, the MLA for Saanich North and the Islands, he's part of the committee now that is looking at the Police Act, and they have been hearing from a lot of experts and a lot of stakeholders who have identified the ways in which policing is a part of systemic racism. We know that the justice system it has systemic racism. We know that our education system has systemic racism.
Army.
So this is the work that presents itself to us, and that we have to lean into and identify a future that we want, and then move towards that urgently.
So मेरी गल सोनिया ਨਾਲ ਚੱਲੀ ਸੀਗੀ, हैरी एंड मेगन रॉयल कपल है, ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਵਰਲਡ ਵਾਈਡ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਵੇਵਸ ਬਣਾਈਆਂ ਜਦੋਂ ਮੇਗਨ ਨੇ ਮੈਂਸ਼ਨ ਕੀਤਾ ਕਿ there was a concern at the royal family that baby's skin color. So ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਾਫੀ ਇਸ਼ੂ ਉੱਭਰ ਕੇ ਆਏ ਹੈ, ਤੇ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਸੋਨੀਆ ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਜੋਰਜ ਫਲੋਇਡ ਦਾ ਕੇਸ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੈਗਾ, ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਇਲਾਵਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ colonialism ਚੱਲ ਰਿਹਾ, because she work in a child care system and she knows, ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਰੈਜ਼ੀਡੈਂਸ਼ੀਅਲ ਸਕੂਲ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਬਲਮ ਹੈ, ਪੁਲਿਸ ਐਕਟ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈਗਾ ਆ, ਉਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ I mentioned that army. So everywhere ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹ ਚੱਲ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ, ਉਹ ਇਹਨੂੰ forefront ਤੇ ਲਿਆਉਣਾ ਤੇ ਇਹਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਨਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਹੈ. So and it's a very fitting at this point, Sonia. So do you think the royalty still have a time and place? Queen is still ahead of Canada. And what do you think about that?
That's a big question, CJ.
It is a big.
As a historian, I studied the origins of Westminster Parliament, and I've there's a long history, and our institutions are very much connected and deeply embedded in this. I think it is a fair conversation to be having right now about what is the future of Canadian parliamentary democracy, and it's a conversation that not just about what role should the Queen and the royal family play and the monarchy play in our democracy, but how do we always try to strengthen our democracy? We have some parts of how our democracy works and our political institutions and government are losing trust from the public. And so if we really value democracy, and I think we have to, it is so essential, we have to always be asking ourselves, how do we strengthen it? How do we make it better? And ultimately, the question that you ask is a question that we do need to be asking. Do we still need to be tied to the monarchy in England, or do we move forward as a independent parliamentary system? That is a very big conversation.
It's a pretty heavy duty question. So मैं सोनिया ਨੂੰ ਪੁੱਛਿਆ ਸੀ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕੁਈਨ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਹਲੇ ਵੀ ਆਪਣੀ ਮੋਨਾਰਕ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, ਹੈ ਨਾ। ਸੋ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਕਿਹਾ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਸਿਸਟਮ ਹਲੇ ਇਹਦੀ ਕੋਈ ਵੈਲੀਡੇਸ਼ਨ ਦਾ ਸੈਂਸ ਬਣਦਾ ਕਿ ਨਹੀਂ। ਐਂਡ ਸੋਨੀਆ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਇਟਸ ਅ ਹੈਵੀ ਡਿਊਟੀ ਕੁਐਸਚਨ, ਐਂਡ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਆਪਣੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਨਵਰਸੇਸ਼ਨ ਹੈ ਕੈਨੇਡੀਅਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਹੋਣੀ ਚਾਹੀਦੀ ਹੈ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਨਵਰਸੇਸ਼ਨ ਹੈ ਇਸ ਦਾ ਥਾਂ ਜਾਂ ਪਲੇਸ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੈ ਜਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ, ਉਹਦੀ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਸ ਕੀ ਹੈ, ਪਾਰਲੀਮੈਂਟਰੀ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਆਪਣਾ ਸਿਸਟਮ ਹੈ ਉਹਦੇ ਕਿਹੜੇ ਆਪਾਂ ਚੇਂਜਿਸ ਜਾਂ ਰਿਫਾਈਨਮੈਂਟ ਲਿਆ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ। So that was very well said, Sonia. I know all the Canadians need to be consulted and there should be a discussion. When something like this happens, always a conversation comes up, and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh mentioned towards that we should have a conversation, and I think it's about time.
And I'll leave it to the federal politicians to do it.
Well, it should start from there.
Yeah.
There's a federal jurisdiction about all this, and it will be interesting because Prime Minister not directly said anything, but he very categorically mentioned that racism have no time and place in Canada. So he made it very clear rather than talking about royalty.
Yeah. I agree with him on that.
So that was a good way of saying, and like we talked about, and we'll talk about more, the focus, he said, and today President Joe Biden addressed the nation very well. He signed the $1.9 trillion bill, so that was his first victory, and at the same time he said he want all Americans to be in to solve this COVID problem that they have, and they are bumping up the game and increasing the vaccination. So in that scenario, what do you think about our status here about a vaccination in Canada, well, especially in British Columbia? Mm-hmm. Let's focus on the BC.
Well, I'm heartened to see the vaccinations the rollout start to move more quickly. And I know it got to a bumpy start on Monday with the call centers not being able to handle the call volume, but it's good to see that got solved and that people are getting their vaccinations booked. I know that people were heartened and happy to hear the news today that the public health orders are going to allow for a few people to gather outside. And I think that, a year into this crisis and this pandemic, that capacity, that ability to connect face to face with people, even outside and even just a small number of people, is going to make a really big difference for a lot of people who have been lonely for this last year and very isolated. The race we seem to be in is, you know, the variants, the COVID-19 variants, and the vaccines, and that is the race that seems to be underway. We've been holding just around 500 cases a day for quite a long time now, and that's a lot of new cases every day when you think of that, and a certain percentage of those.
The number is not gone down, Sonia.
No.
Still.
It's not gone down, and one of the things that we've been talking about is long COVID or COVID long haulers, and it's from the data from the United States and the UK shows that about 30% of people who have COVID end up with symptoms that last for weeks or months. I have a friend who contracted COVID a year ago, and he is still dealing with some pretty serious symptoms right now around his heart. And so this is the other consideration, is that as these cases, you know, at 500 a day, if you think 30% of those, that's every 2 days, you know, there's 300 people that could potentially have long COVID symptoms. And that has really serious implications for disability payments, for people being able to work, for the long-term implications of that. So we are a long ways from fully understanding all of the impacts and consequences of this disease. And I think it's still on all of us to do our very best to stay safe, to not get infected, or to keep our chances very low, and to keep our loved ones protected.
So, Sonia, मैं पूछा सीगा कि ਜਿਹੜੀ ਵੈਕਸੀਨੇਸ਼ਨ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਟੇਜ ਹੈ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਬਾਰੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਕੀ ਖਿਆਲ ਹੈ। ਸੋ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਬਿਕਾਜ਼ ਆਫ ਦ ਫੋਨ ਲਾਈਨਸ ਐਂਡ ਨਾਟ ਅ ਪ੍ਰੋਪਰ ਸਿਸਟਮ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਥੋੜੇ ਜਿਹਾ ਸਨੈਗ ਆਇਆ, ਬਟ ਨਾਓ ਇਟਸ ਬੈਕ ਐਂਡ ਰਨਿੰਗ, ਐਂਡ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਥੋੜੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਰਿਲੈਕਸੇਸ਼ਨ ਵੀ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਬੌਨੀ ਹੈਨਰੀ ਨੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਅਨਾਉਂਸ ਕੀਤੇ, ਪਰ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕੇਸਿਸ ਆ ਪਰ ਡੇ ਸਟਿਲ 500, that's not changed. So ਇਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਕਿ ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਹਲੇ ਵੀ ਬੜਾ ਵਿਜੀਲੈਂਟ ਲੈਣਾ ਪੈਣਾ ਆ, ਹਲੇ ਵੀ ਜਿੰਨਾ ਚਿਰ I think, Sonia, until people like 70-80% people are vaccinated, even President Biden said that, you know, his goal is to by July 4th, because that's America Day. By then, he said, we will have it, you know, if we stay vigilant. Same thing here, that as you said, we have 500 cases, and if the number stays the steady, and so, you know, that's still, the problem is not solved.
Yeah. And again, you know, I worry about there have been over 12,000 cases in children, and we don't know the long-term effects for children, and we may not know that for a long time. You know, this is the reality we're in, is this is an entirely new disease, and we're going to be studying it for years and decades to come. And just like with our learning about how do we do better with long-term care homes, I think we also have to look at how do we improve our preparedness for pandemics. A lot of epidemiologists are saying this is not going to be the last pandemic that our world sees. And how are we going to improve the conditions so that we aren't perfectly creating conditions for the next pandemic? And these are very serious conversations we need to be having, and these things are not disconnected. We know that climate change, for example, is connected to higher rates of disease. We're seeing tropical diseases moving further and further out of tropical regions. You know, we have to understand that we want to make our policies focused on health and well-being of everybody in our society. And to do that, we need long-term thinking. We need proactive and preventative thinking, and we need to focus on how do we become a healthier society.
ਸੋ ਸੋਨੀਆ ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਆ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਪੈਰਾਡੈਮਿਕ ਦੀ ਸਿਚੁਏਸ਼ਨ ਹੈ ਇਹ ਹਲੇ ਫਾਰ ਫਰੋਮ ਰਿਜ਼ੋਲਵਡ ਹੈਗੀ ਤੇ ਕਈ ਇਸ਼ੂਜ਼ ਹੈ ਵੇਰੀਐਂਟ ਦਾ ਇਸ਼ੂ ਹੈਗਾ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਕਿ 12,000 ਜਿਹੜੇ ਚਿਲਡਰਨ ਹੈ they are diagnosed ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਕੰਡੀਸ਼ਨ ਕੀ ਹੋਣੀ ਹੈ it's a long term issues and the climate change goes hand in hand ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਆ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਜੇ ਕਲਾਈਮੇਟ ਨੂੰ ਕੰਟਰੋਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰਦੇ that impacts negatively as well so a long term conversation to planning the load here. You're talking about Sonia. Tell me a little bit about 12,000 children that are diagnosed for COVID. How that number is different than adults or seniors?
Well, the BC Center for Disease Control publishes these figures, so it's possible for all of us to go and see exactly how many people have been diagnosed with COVID-19, and they break it down by age groups. And we have seen since the new year a large number of young people becoming infected. Now they tend to have sometimes asymptomatic or very minimal symptoms, and that's a relief. But again, the longer term questions, and I just think we're going to have to be really monitoring the data and monitoring the evidence around this and ensuring that we're prepared for any long-term effects of this.
So when I ਪੁੱਛਿਆ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੇ children ਹੈ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਕੀ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੇ diagnosed ਹੋਏ ਆ according to the CDC numbers ਜਿਹੜੇ ਹੈ Center for Disease Control ਉਹਨਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ numbers ਦਾ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਆ ਤੇ ਫਿਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ impact ਹੈਗਾ ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਜਦੋਂ data ਆਊਗਾ ਉਦੋਂ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗੂਗਾ. I think that the biggest thing about all these numbers who are looking is it data, science behind it, and long term, like you mentioned, the impact of these. And also you mentioned that it's not over yet, as the scientists are saying, it might be another pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then let's also turn our attention to the other scientists who have been ringing alarm bells for many decades now, and this is the climate scientists, and that just as we were largely unprepared for a pandemic, we are also not heeding the calls and the advice of climate scientists who are really identifying how important it is that we be proactive on reducing our emissions, on protecting biodiversity, on becoming more resilient. We need to transition our economies really urgently because the impacts of climate change are increasingly severe and significant around the world.
So ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਦੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ ਸੀ children ਜਾਂ science ਜਾਂ data ਜਦੋਂ ਆਊਗਾ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਹੋਰ ਕਲੀਅਰ ਪਿਕਚਰ ਮਿਲੂਗੀ ਪਰ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਇਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕਲਾਈਮੇਟ ਚੇਂਜ ਹੈ that's equally important and talking about protection of old growth forests and all that. How for my viewers sake and their knowledge and you live that life and how the environment, if we are not vigilant and not stay on guard for that, how that's going to affect us and coming generations.
And the way that I look at it, and this comes back to what got me into politics. As you pointed out at the very beginning, there was a permit that was issued by the provincial government to put a contaminated landfill at the headwaters of the drinking watershed in Shawnigan Lake. So partway up a mountain with the creek that feeds into the lake, which is a drinking water source for 12,000 people, putting a 5 million ton contaminated landfill site there. That was what the permit allowed. And our community, for the better part of 4 years, really fought back against that because I think almost anybody would recognize the risk of putting contaminants that are dangerous to human health in a drinking watershed is not a good idea. We know that we rely on clean, safe water in order to stay healthy and to thrive. So if we look at our natural systems, our ecosystems, our environment, and we recognize the role that they play in ensuring that we can be healthy and we can be well, we need clean air to breathe, we need clean, safe water to drink, and we need healthy food to eat. And if we aren't taking care of our environment and our ecosystems, they are not going to be able to provide these, essentially, these life-giving services that they have been providing, that our environment provides to us. And we can see, the impacts of that in communities where there is outbreaks of disease related to waterborne illness, or where we lose arable soil from industrial farming practices, where we lose the biodiversity that we have in forests. And that biodiversity is very important for finding medicines and for finding cures to ailments and diseases that we have. So that interconnectedness of us and our environment is something that we really do have to come to terms with. And it can be hard to remember that when we live in big cities surrounded by concrete towers and we're driving on cars. But in Vancouver and Victoria, the wonderful thing that they have is that the cities have bought their watersheds, and their watersheds are completely protected. So you don't have to worry about water if you live in a city like Vancouver or Victoria, because the government had the forethought and the looking ahead to recognize how essential it is to have a protected water source. That's how we have to think widely.
So मैं सोनिया ने पूछा सी कि ਜਿਹੜਾ environment ਹੈ ਉਹ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ impact ਕਰਦਾ ਆ. So ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਕਿ environment it goes hand in hand with the people's quality of life. ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਕਿ ਜੇ ਆਪਾਂ clean air ਨਹੀਂ breathe ਕਰਦੇ, ਜਾਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਕੋਲ safe water ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗਾ, ਜਾਂ ਆਪਣਾ healthy food ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗਾ, so our quality of life effect ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ. ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਕਿ ਜਿਵੇਂ ਹੁਣ ਵੈਨਕੂਵਰ ਤੇ ਵਿਕਟੋਰੀਆ, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਆਪਦੇ watersheds ਨੂੰ control ਕੀਤਾ ਤਾਂ ਕਿ people get a clean water. But still, if you think about, Sonia, the indigenous people still not in all the communities not still have a clean water.
There are a lot of communities, let's start with First Nation communities across Canada that haven't had safe drinking water now for decades. And the federal government has promised to bring safe drinking water to First Nations communities, but has been unable to deliver that promise in a lot of communities. Here in Cowichan, it was only about a year ago that a significant part of Cowichan tribes were able to get access to safe drinking water. Meanwhile, the city of Duncan, right next door, everybody there had access to safe drinking water. And this is another one of these sort of systemic inequalities that exist. There are drinking water and boil water advisories in communities in British Columbia happening at any given time in communities all over the province. And that can be as a result of impacts from logging activities where there's too much sediment. It can be an impact from things getting into the drinking water that are dangerous. And it can be an impact from other industrial activity. Up in the Northeast, one of the concerns we have about fracking is that they are finding levels of benzene in the drinking water because it's getting in to the aquifers. And that benzene is showing up in the urine of pregnant women. And this is something that we should be very concerned about, because we know that science tells us how dangerous benzene is to the health of people, but very importantly to the health of a baby. So we have to be, again, evidence-driven and aware of how the choices we're making are impacting the health and well-being. And this comes back to COVID. We have made a choice as a society to make enormous sacrifices to protect the health of the majority of people in our society. And we have to apply that in other decisions we make. how are we going to protect the health and well-being of people with all of the choices that we're making?
ਸੋ ਸੋਨੀਆ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਪੁੱਛਿਆ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆ ਇੰਡੀਜਨਸ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀਜ਼ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹਾਲੇ ਤੱਕ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਲੀਨ ਵਾਟਰ ਦੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਬਲਮ ਹੈ ਤਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਬ੍ਰਿਟਿਸ਼ ਕੋਲੰਬੀਆ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਪ੍ਰੋਬਲਮ ਹੈ ਆਲਵੇਜ਼ ਕੋਈ ਨਾ ਕੋਈ ਬੋਇਲਡ ਵਾਟਰ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ ਵਾਰਨਿੰਗਸ ਇਸ਼ੂ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਰਹਿੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਏਰੀਆ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਐਂਡ ਸਰਟਨ ਏਰੀਆਜ਼ ਆਰ ਵਰਸ ਦੈਨ ਅਦਰਸ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹ ਹੈ ਵੀ ਕਈਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਾਣੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਗੈਸਿਸ ਹੈ ਜਾਂ ਅਦਰ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਬੈਂਜੀਨ ਇਜ਼ ਅਨਦਰ ਵਨ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਕੋਈ ਜੇ ਲੇਡੀਜ਼ ਪ੍ਰੈਗਨੈਂਟ ਲੇਡੀ ਪੀਂਦੀ ਹੈ ਤਾਂ ਉਹ ਬੱਚੇ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਉਹ ਹਾਰਮ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੀ ਹੈ ਐਂਡ ਸੋ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਕਿ ਸੇਮ ਥਿੰਗ ਵਿਦ COVID-19 whatever the issues we were addressing the similar issues we needed to address overall. So talking about while we are at environment and we're talking about issues, Keystone Pipeline. So and when Mr. Joe Biden came as a president, right away it was one of the goals was to scrap that Keystone Pipeline. But on the other side, for British Columbia and for Canada, especially for Alberta, that pipeline is so crucial, providing jobs, and they find it is safer than tankers. What are your party's take on this Keystone Pipeline?
Yeah, well, there is a real need to transition our economy, and this is what where we have to start is what do we owe future generations? So do we owe future generations a safe, livable planet? And if we agree that we do, and I think most of us would agree that we owe our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren a livable planet, I think that we have to look at how do we transition our economy. The reality is that the clean energy economy, if we were to invest in developing a clean, renewable energy economy where we were creating locally produced renewable energy, BC and Alberta have enormous geothermal potential. There's wind, there's solar. The very interesting thing about this is that the renewable energy economy produces more jobs than the oil and gas economy. The other thing about the oil and gas economy is that it is heavily subsidized by both the federal and provincial governments. Imagine if that subsidy or those investments were going into building that clean energy economy infrastructure. We could be seeing not jobs where people have to go off to a work camp and live in an isolated place and be away from their family, but we could see jobs in the energy sector that are located in your community where you're creating this clean energy and resiliency for your own community.
So मैं सोनिया ने पूछा सी कि कीस्टोन पाइपलाइन के बारे इन्हां दा की ख्याल है क्योंकि ਇਹ BC ਨੂੰ ਇੰਪੈਕਟ ਕਰਦਾ ਹੈ ਅਲਬਰਟਾ ਨੂੰ ਇੰਪੈਕਟ ਕਰਦਾ ਜੌਬਸ ਨੂੰ ਇੰਪੈਕਟ ਕਰਦਾ ਹੈ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਕਿ ਹੌਲੀ ਹੌਲੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਸੋਚਣਾ ਪੈਣਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਨੈਕਸਟ ਜਨਰੇਸ਼ਨਸ ਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਲਈ ਆਪਾਂ ਕੀ ਛੱਡ ਕੇ ਜਾਣਾ ਹੈ ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਫੋਕਸ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਆਪਣੇ ਕਲੀਨ એનર્ਜੀ ਤੇ ਫੋਕਸ ਹੋਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਜਿਹਦੇ 'ਚ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵਿੰਡ એનર્ਜੀ ਲਾ ਲਓ ਸੋਲਰ એનર્ਜੀ ਲਾ ਲਓ ਸੋ ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਫੈਡਰਲ ਗੌਰਮੈਂਟ ਜਾਂ ਅਦਰ ਗੌਰਮੈਂਟਸ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਦੂਜੇ ਪਲਾਨ ਪਾਈਪਲਾਈਨਸ ਦੇ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਸਬਸਿਡਾਈਜ਼ ਕਰਨ ਦੀ ਬਜਾਏ ਜੇ ਇੱਧਰ ਇਨਵੈਸਟ ਕਰਨ ਤਾਂ long term ਜਿਹੜੇ ਆ ਉਹਦੇ ਫਾਇਦੇ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਹੈ. Let's switch a little bit gears. Sonia here is there's a lot of fentanyl and death issues. It's actually alarming. Year over year, it's increased by 76%, and we see people dying every day. It's a bigger problem than COVID-19, don't you think?
It is. Well, we saw the data today that more people are dying from toxic drug poisoning than from COVID-19, and the people who are dying are younger. And so, in terms of years of lives lost, the toxic drug supply issue is actually second only to cancer in British Columbia in terms of the years of lives lost of British Columbians. I've been Adam and I have been calling on government to follow the recommendations of Dr. Bonnie Henry's 2019 report called Stop the Harm, where she said that the province has tools at its disposal to decriminalize drug users. So people who use drugs, not treating them as criminals, but recognizing that this is a health issue, and increasingly, as you point out, it is a life or death issue. The drug supply has become so poisonous that we are now losing 5 people's lives every single day in British Columbia. And I think it's really important. There's been some very good coverage in the media lately. If the Globe and Mail a couple of weeks ago had a story of 100 people in Canada who have lost their lives, this is not what any of us would think as a stereotype or somebody who overdoses. The drug supply is so toxic right now that people can die from taking one, having one drug use, and they will die. And the vast majority of people are dying in their homes alone. The majority are men, younger men, and I think we have to start from a place of compassion and look at the humans and the lives that they are losing. And the thing that the experts have been calling for is decriminalization and access to a regulated and controlled supply of drugs, so that people who are suffering from drug dependency can get stabilized and not have to be in that state of being involved in the illicit drug trade. And then we move into therapy and treatment and support and housing, all of these things. But the emergency right now is that people are dying so quickly. From Dr. Henry's 2019 report, there are over 100,000 British Columbians who are struggling with opioid substance use disorder, as she put it. That's 100,000 of our fellow citizens. And I think we have to really ask that question of ourselves. Are we okay with their lives being at risk every single day? Or do we want government to act to take away that terrible risk that they're facing, and then be there to provide the therapy and the help and the support for people to become well and healthy?
So मैं सोनिया ਨੂੰ ਪੁੱਛਿਆ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਡਰਗ ਫੈਂਟਨਲ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਬਲਮ ਇੱਥੇ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ, ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਬਲਮ ਹੈ। ਸੋ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਇਟਸ ਅ ਵੈਰੀ ਟਰੂ, ਇਟਸ ਅ ਬਿਗ ਪ੍ਰੋਬਲਮ। ਆਪਣੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਡਿਕ੍ਰਿਮੀਨਲਾਈਜ਼ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ ਆ, ਐਂਡ ਪੀਪਲਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਟਸ ਅ ਹੈਲਥ ਇਸ਼ੂ, ਐਂਡ ਕੰਪੈਸ਼ਨ ਨਾਲ ਡੀਲ ਕਰਨਾ ਪੈਣਾ। ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਕਿ 2019 ਡਾਕਟਰ ਬੋਨੀ ਹੈਨਰੀ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਰਿਪੋਰਟ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਸੀਗੀ, ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲਾਇਆ ਕਿ 100,000 people, that's a lot of people are suffering with opioid crisis and related issues. So we have a couple of minutes left, Sonia. How fast that time is, go as we have a lot of things to cover. Just one clarification and your final comments. One is, you want to decriminalize all kind of drugs in any quantity?
No. It's as her recommendation, it's decriminalizing small quantities, so that people aren't being arrested or criminalized for the possession of a small quantity of drugs. I'm not arguing for decriminalization of all quantity of all drugs. I think we have to just recognize how urgent this health crisis is right now and act with that same urgency.
So Sonia ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਪੁੱਛਿਆ ਸੀ ਕਿ decriminalization, just clarification purposes ਨਾਲ ਵੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਖੁੱਲੀ ਛੁੱਟੀ ਦੇ ਦਈਏ, ਕਹਿੰਦੇ no, with limited supply, not openly making it decriminalized. So thank you for your time, your final comments. You always very gracious to give your time and able to talk to our communities and our viewers. Thank you for your time and your final comment.
Well, CJ, I want to thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and this opportunity to once again meet with you. It's always such a pleasure. And I really look forward to the months ahead when we can see each other in person again. I will absolutely be traveling to communities all around BC, and I cannot wait to be able to see people in their communities and to connect with them in person. And I just really want to thank you for what I consider, we've had many long conversations now. I'm really grateful for the friendship and the opportunity to meet with you.
Thank you, Sonia. And same here. And when you are in a lower mainland next time, just give me a call. We have each other's cell numbers, and it would be nice to do the interview in studio rather than, you are in Victoria, I'm in White Rock, and thankfully the technology is helpful. So thank you very much. So मेरी गल चल रही सी सोनिया फर्स्टनो ਜਿਹੜੇ कि BC ग्रीन पार्टी ਦੇ ਲੀਡਰ ਹਨ। ਇਸੇ ਹੀ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਹਰ ਥਰਸਡੇ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਕਿਸੇ ਨਾ ਕਿਸੇ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਐਕਟਿਵਿਸਟ ਦਾ ਪੋਲੀਟੀਸ਼ੀਅਨਸ ਨਾਲ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਾਈ ਦੀ ਹੈ। ਪਲੀਜ਼ ਗਿਵ ਯੂਰ ਫੀਡਬੈਕ, ਜ਼ਰੂਰ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਕਰੋ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਲੱਗਿਆ ਤੇ ਕਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੇ ਪੀਪਲਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਆਪਾਂ ਇਨਵਾਈਟ ਕਰਕੇ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਵੱਧ ਤੋਂ ਵੱਧ ਇਨਫੋਰਮੇਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਸਕੀਏ। ਜਿਵੇਂ ਸੋਨੀਆ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਐਂਡ Dr. Bonnie Henry, hale khulli chutti nahi deni. The COVID is still real, is still around, and so still watch yourself, wash your hands, keep your distance, and be healthy and happy, and have a wonderful weekend. Rab rak.